Hey guys, Alton here from Microgrinder Poker School, and for today's video we have a selected video from our MTT 101 course that's created by George Mathis, our resident MTT pro. So hope you guys enjoy the video. This course is a comprehensive beginner's guide to microstakes online MTTs. So let's go ahead and let's get into the video.
What's up guys? So in this video we're going to look closer at pre-flop ranges. Now there's a lot to digest here, from opening ranges to cooling theory, as well as some 3-betting and 4-betting stuff. So let's get right into it. Now the first thing we're going to talk about is opening ranges. All players should have a kind of good grasp in their head of what kind of cards they want to be opening. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes people make, is they're a bit too loose with their opening generally, and having this kind of guide to refer to is really helpful. So, in general, I do want to say that ranges, although they should be used as a guide, are not prescriptive. And what I mean by this is that there are a lot of factors which can change these opening ranges. So, for example, multiple short stacks that can shove behind your open. This is something we'll talk about later when we look at the hands being played out. Another example is if you've got really aggressive players to your left, because you don't want to be opening a wide, loose range if you have aggressive players that are raising behind you. And the other reason is potentially that if you're at a very tight table, if the players that you're playing with are not playing many hands, they're folding a lot, they're being very passive, we can get away with opening more hands. So for this reason, I just want to highlight that although these ranges are a really good guide to kind of remember, you should be deviating from them as and when you see potential adjustments. Another key point of tournament opening ranges that's specific to this is that we can open with a wider range when an ante is in play. Now, this is because ultimately we're getting better pot odds when there's an ante in play, so we can open with a slightly wider range as a result. You'll notice that these ranges, in regards to the ante, although we do open up a few more hands as a result of the ante, we don't go too crazy, because I do think playing a really strong range at the micro stakes, particularly if you're a beginning player and you're not that confident post-flop, I think it's definitely the best way to go. Players play far too loose at the micro stakes, and the best way to exploit this is play a nice tight is right strategy. And you'll notice that the other thing about the ranges is that they are very tight from earlier positions, and they slowly get wider as we move around to the button. The button's the widest opening range because we have position, and the small blind is a little bit less wide because we're out of position, but still going to be wider than our earlier position opens because we want to try and steal the dead money in the pot. So let's take a closer look at these. So we'll kick off with the under the gun and under the gun +1. Now, we've given the same range to both of these two positions because they're essentially both very tight. You can see this here with the percentage of all hands being 7.09. And so that is the red colour on this chart. So the loosest offsuit ace we're going to open is ace-queen. With the antes, we can widen this slightly to ace-jack and ace-10. You'll notice also with these very bottom pairs, we do exclude these from our range. I think the reason being is that ultimately these 2s, 3s, and even 4s and 5s to an extent, they don't realise their equity very well post-flop. If we flop a set, we do make great money, but most of the time we're going to not be able to. And this means we'll probably be folding quite a lot post-flop, and we'll fail to realise all of our equity. We'll get blown off it, so to speak. Middle position, we start to open up a little bit with about a 4% increase. Now opening 11%. The kind of additions to this, if we just go back and check, we've added in some Jack 10 suited, some 10-9 suited. These suited connectors, they play very well when called because, well, for a few reasons. First, their pairs are not particularly dominated, so The 9, for example, is rarely going to be dominated by hands in our opponent's cooling range. They also have the potential to make lots of strong hands, and I think the most sort of appealing factor is that having these kind of more diverse hands in our opening range allows us to flop strong combinations over a variety of textures. This is something you'll get a better sense of when you watch some post-flop play that we'll talk about in a bit. But having these lower cards means that we can perform well on different boards. If you have a range which is just weighted to all of these broadways, then on these lower boards, on the like 6, 7, 8s, things like that, you'll start to get into a little bit of trouble in that you can't always have the nuts. And by nuts, I mean the strongest possible hand. Now, onto the low jack raise first in. Again, a little bit wider, so 13% now, and with the ante, we add that on a little bit more. The main changes here are that we add suited aces in. These tend to perform pretty well. The ace highs can defend their equity well, particularly these suited ones. And then we do just add in with the antes a couple more of these lower suited connectors. Again, this is just adding to our board coverage. And onto the hijack. Things start to get a little bit wider now. We can now open any suited ace. You will notice that we're still pretty tight on our offsuit opening combinations. These hands just don't play so well in that you're not going to be able to realize your equity. When you have these flush draws, you're more likely to stick about post-flop and have the potential to win a very big pot, / with a strong hand by the river. Less so when you don't have these stronger flush potentials. So for this reason, we keep these mostly out of our opening range. Cut-off, you'll start to notice that the ace-9 creeps in, and we've got a couple of the weaker aces in there as well. One thing that is worth noting here is you'll see in the ante ranges that we have ace-5 off and ace-4 off. Now, in terms of raw equity, a hand like a6 or a7 might be, or is, slightly better in terms of raw card equity. But the reason we prefer to open ace-4 off and ace-5 off rather than ace-6 or ace-7, despite them being slightly weaker in a raw equity sense, is that they're better connected, and for the same reason that we prefer to play flush hands, we'd also prefer to play connected hands. So you'll notice here there's actually starting to get a bigger disparity with the without ante and with ante ranges. So there's now almost a 9% difference. And our button, this is where things are going to start to get very loose. You'll notice from this point, we can more or less open close to half the deck. Without antes, it's going to be just under that. And with antes, it's going to be very close to it. Again, we prioritize suited hands way down, even if they're unconnected at this point. It's just with a positional advantage, all of these hands are going to realize their equity very well. Particularly when we have initiative, we can c-bet frequently, and this is something you'll see us doing later in the post-flop plays. So small blind, for the reason given that we talked about slightly before, is that the small blind is slightly tighter than our button opening range. This is mainly because we're out of position as the small blind, and although we have some extra dead money committed to the pot with our small blind, incentivizing us to raise, we don't want to get too crazy with it, because a competent big blind player can really abuse a small blind that opens too wide a range. This is primarily because, and as you'll see us suggest, the big blind should be cooling and defending their big blind at a very high frequency. This is mainly because, particularly when there's an ante in play, the price you need on a call and the equity you need is extremely low. And so that's it for the opening ranges. Now we'll move on to cooling ranges. The first point I want to stress is that our pre-flop cooling range facing an open should be tighter than our pre-flop opening range. Now, the reason for this is that when we're opening as the pre-flop raiser, we actually have fold equity. So we'll be opening hands which, while they're definitely weaker in our range, they will be profitable profitable because at some portion of the time we will get a walk, so to speak, and everybody will fold and will steal the money. When you call, this isn't an option. And so our calling range should be tighter than our opening range, but it should definitely not be tighter than our 3-betting range. And that's something that we'll get onto in a little bit. The big blind's the exception to this, for the reason we just discussed. The big blind's getting a very good price on their calls, and so their calling ranges can get away with being much looser. Now, another thing to note about calling ranges is that when we call, our range can be described as capped. Now, we talked about this in the poker jargon section. This means that if we're facing a raiser and we call, we're expected to be 3-betting with all of our very strong hands. And so because we don't 3-bet or re-raise with them, it's assumed that our calling range generally does not contain those very strong hands. This will have post-flop implications in terms of being at a range disadvantage / range advantage on some boards. And again, this will start to make more sense in the post-flop section. So in terms of working out the kind of maths behind the equity you need to call, we can do this using pot odds. And now the equation for this is call size call size divided by pot size plus call size times 100. And that timesing 100 will get your answer as a percentage. And that percentage will be the equity that your hand needs versus the opponent's range to call. Now, this is a little bit out of the scope of the course, so we won't be looking at examples of calling ranges versus raising ranges. But if you want to do this yourself, what you can do is fire in an opening range into a tool like Equilab, and then enter hands which you want to potentially call with, and see how much equity you need versus that range. The other thing to think about when calling is that depending on the position you're calling from, you may realize more or less equity. So from the button, you're going to realize your equity a lot better than if you call from, say, the small blind. This is because you have a positional advantage on the button, so you'll be able to realize more of your equity, you'll be able to play draws more, you can potentially bluff if your opponent checks to you. So for that reason, you've got to think about equity realization as well when calling. Now, onto 3-betting. This is the fun stuff. So first off, why should we 3-bet? The most obvious and the biggest reason is to get value. If we have hands like aces and kings, queens, ace-king, we want to build the size of the pot, because these hands are very strong. And by building the pot early, we set ourselves up a good opportunity to make the pot even bigger on later streets. Now, the second reason, and this does factor in for sure, is to push fold equity. This similarly applies to hands like ace-queen, ace-jack, hands that, although they're strong enough to be 3-betting, getting folds when we 3-bet with a hand like this is definitely not a bad result. It's also recommended to use a smaller 3-betting size when you're in position, so that is around 3 times the opening size, plus 2 big blinds for every caller. Make sure you do this, because if you don't add in the extra 2 big blinds, you then give all of the players behind a very good price on a call, and particularly at the micro stakes when players love to call anyway, if you make it too small, everybody will come along. The other reason is just to isolate weaker players. So if there's a player particularly that's opening very wide, say they're kind of marked as a fish, by 3-betting we'll often get the opportunity to play them heads up in a pot. And being against a fish heads up, particularly if you have position, is a really nice spot. So we'll use a larger size when out of position. This is because we want to push a little bit more fold equity. Playing out of position is tough, and we'll under-realize our equity in general when we are playing post-flop out of position. The final key point is that your 3-betting range ultimately changes depending upon the position of the opener. This is because depending on their opening range, we can be 3-betting looser or tighter. If they have a very tight 3-betting range under the gun, it doesn't make sense for us to be 3-betting a very loose range, because that range will perform very badly against their opening range. So now we'll get into a couple of examples just to emphasize this point. So this is the under the gun raise first in range that we just looked at. And now if you're in the small blind, with a 3-betting range at this point, you'll see that the only hands we 3-bet are aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king and ace-queen suited. Now, this may seem very tight, but against a proper under-the-gun opening range, this is definitely what it should look like. Particularly in these softer games where players do call too much, we're going to do much better when we play a tight range, but play that tight range quite aggressively, so 3-betting with it rather than slow playing and trying to get the value as soon as we can. Now, to emphasize the point of how 3-betting ranges change, let's look at the blind versus blind situation. So here we have the small blind raising first in range, pretty wide as we said, about 35% of hands, and now here the big blind 3-betting range, it's a lot wider. And this is, I really think this is something that you should stick to, even at the micro stakes, because players tend to open very wide from the small blind, and as we were talking about punishing small blind players, 3-betting a lot is a really good way to do it, particularly with these sorts of hands, because all of these hands perform really well post-flop. We've got suited aces, we've got good board coverage with these suited connected hands. This allows us, or gives us a lot of opportunities to bluff. So I'd really recommend this big blind 3-betting strategy, and just take in how much wider it is the later the position of the opener is. So now we'll take a quick look at calling 3-bets. The same maths applies as did with the regular calling ranges, the calling range versus a pre-flop open. So we have the same equation just written here. And we talk about equity realization again. This applies a little bit more in 3-bet pots, because when we're calling, facing a 3-bet, the 3-betting range, particularly at the micros, because it doesn't happen often, is likely to be very strong. And the 3-better will also enjoy initiative. So this means they can fire C-bets on the flop and turn with a perceived stronger range than us. This is because it's, again, with 3-betting capped ranges, it's assumed that if we had a very strong hand, like aces or kings, these would likely be played as 4-bets. Another thing that matters, focus on 3-bet size, and this applies to raising ranges as well in relation to a calling range. So the smaller the 3-bet, the wider we can call, because the better price we're getting in terms of pot odds, so the less equity we need. Same applies for opening ranges, so if someone opens to 2x, we can call a lot wider than if they open to 4x. Finally, we just mentioned post-flop playability, and so we generally want to call 3-bets with the same sorts of hands that we talk about 3-betting ourselves on the kind of looser portion, so those suited connectors, things like that. So here's an example just to show you how these equity calculations work in action. So here we're at a 9-handed table, 10% ante. Small blind opens to 3 big blinds, which is perfectly normal. I recommend doing this all of the time, even if you're shorter stacked. We just want to maximize our fold equity from the small blind. If we make it 2x, excuse me, the player in the big blind can call with more or less anything. So in the example here, you'll see the big blind makes a very small 3-bet. And again, this is just to emphasize how calling range changes. The big blind makes it just over 2x the size of our raise. So we only need to call 3.5 big blinds to win 10.4 big blinds. And now when we put this into the equation, it means that the equity we need versus that player's range is 25.1%. And versus a big blind 3-betting range, which, as we said, should be quite wide, we can definitely call with a reasonable amount of hands when we only need 25.1% equity. And this is what you're going to see here. So, on the left we have what the big blind 3-betting range looks like. Again, loosening up a bit with the 7-6, the 7-8, the low suited aces. And the cooling range consists of some stronger aces, some king queens, king jacks, queen 10, jack 10, 10 9, and also we have some of the slightly higher pocket pairs. Now, we don't want to get too wide with cooling with these types of hands because you'll ultimately see that we under-realize our equity with them. Now, here, this chart shows the equity that our hand has, that is the small blind, facing the big blind's 3-betting range. So these very green hands obviously perform extremely well, and what we've tried to do is pick hands which have a decent amount of equity. So here, considering we need 25.1% to profitably call, we go for a lot higher than that. The main reason is that, as we discussed, we will under-realize our equity being out of position against a stronger range. So we're playing on the slightly safe side by ensuring we definitely have enough equity. Even these weaker hands, so to speak, like the 10-9s, the jack 10s, and the queen 10s, these have close to 40% equity. You also see we don't want to be calling with the weaker aces like this, although in terms of raw equity, as we discussed earlier, it has a little bit more, the ace-5 off, 40%. These hands just play badly because we're going to be dominated a lot by our opponent's stronger aces when we call with these weaker ones. Now, finally, we're going to talk about 4-betting. Now, ultimately, I do think 4-betting at the micro stakes should be done infrequently. Main reason for this is that 3-betting ranges are typically strong. People aren't 3-betting enough as they should. I think, in general, the player pools lean towards passive play, so calling a lot, limping a lot. And particularly in these early stages, going back to this point, is that we want to play a low variance style. We don't want to be taking any crazy spots when we don't need to be. And in 3-bet pots, playing post-flop, the pots can start to swell. In terms of size, now 4-betting size is a fair bit smaller compared to the 3-bet size. This is in relative terms. So a 4-bet in general will be about 2.5x. The main reason for this is that if we 4-bet with a very large size, say 3.5x, we get to a point where we are almost priced in terms of pot odds and equity to call with our bluffs. This is something you don't want to be doing, so by 4-betting with a smaller size, it allows us to be able to fold if we are 4-bet bluffing. So this is another example of how 4-betting ranges change based upon the 3-bet positioning. So here, this is what the small blind 3-betting range looks like. Very tight. I guess the bluff in here, so to speak, would be ace-queen suited. While it will perform well against a potential under-the-gun calling range, it's not the strongest hand we have. And you'll see we have no bluffs when we're 4-betting versus a small blind 3-bet. This is because we assume that this small blind 3-betting range is very tight, and as we see, it is. You can definitely make adjustments if there are crazy players at the table, say. If there's a very aggressive small blind, then by all means we can start 4-betting wider, we can throw in some ace-kings, some queens. But I think as we talk about minimizing variance, it's nice to be able to call with these hands, the ace-kings, because we are able to see a flop in position versus the small blind, so we still have a positional advantage, and we have a very strong hand that we don't really need to risk all the chips with in these early stages and potentially bust our tournament life. So here's another example. You'll see now, versus a big blind 3-bet, our small blind 4-betting range does go up a bit. These are all for value for the most part, the aces, kings, queens, and ace-kings. But you will see we do throw in 4 combinations as a bluff of the ace-5 suited. Now, I guess the drawback to bluffing in this spot is that, as we've talked about, in general, the micro stakes 3-betting ranges lean on the tighter side. I don't think people 3-bet bluff that much. But having these few amount of combos here, just 4 compared to a 34 of value, is absolutely fine. We have so much value in this range. I think having a couple of bluffs is nice, just to kind of balance out our range, so to speak. So lastly, we're going to talk about stacking off. Now, in these early stages, when we're 50 big blinds plus, we definitely should only be calling all-ins with queens, kings, aces, and ace-king. You'll notice we do have a little star here. The exception, of course, is if there is an absolute crazy player at the table, and you do see these surprisingly often at tournaments. Maybe players that are just shoving every hand. They don't want to play anymore, so they're just going all in, mucking about. Against players like this, if you have a definite read that this is what they're doing, we can definitely stack off with hands like jacks, and I think that's absolutely fine. But in general, we don't want to be going crazy. Now, if effective stacks are 100 big blinds or more, we should limit this range to aces or kings. Again, this might seem tight, but we don't really want to be going broke with a hand like queens. So ideally, it's nice to see a flop if we're very deep. If you get into the 150 big blind, 200 big blind range, we should be calling more and 5-betting less. This is a little bit out of scope of the course, and I think maybe we'll touch on deep stack play in the MTT 202 course. So that's it for this video. I hope you managed to take it all in, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Well, I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please subscribe by hitting that subscription link down below in the video. And also, if you guys are interested in enrolling into this full course, there's a link down below where you can enroll at a discount. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys at our next video. Take care.